Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the Display Dialog commands inbuilt to PowerBasic. PowerBasic allows access to many of the underlying Windows API functions, using a series of wrappers. And two of the wrappers we're going to look at today are the ones to display a color dialog and a display font dialog. These two dialogs will allow a user to select a color or a font. In your applications, you may well have a need to allow the user to configure the application by selecting a specific color for something on screen, or to select a font to change the display. So first of all, we're going to look at the ability to display a color selection dialog. We're going to create a local variable called RGB color selected. We're going to use this variable to store the color that the user has selected. And we're going to populate it by calling a display RGB color function, passing it a single parameter. In this case, we're passing it the desktop. As we're about to display a dialog on screen, the dialog will want to know who the parent dialog is. In this case, it will be the desktop. If you were calling this from one of your own dialogs, you can pass in the handle of that dialog. So let's go ahead and create this new function. So here we have created the skeleton of our new function, taking its single parameter. And we have created a number of local variables which we will use within this function to allow us to display the dialog to the user and to capture the information that they have selected. The first is a flags variable. When we call this dialog, we can set certain flags that change the way the dialog behaves. The next variable is the RGB color value that the user has actually selected. The next variable is first color. This is the default color which is pre-selected on the select color dialog. The X and Y coordinates are the coordinates of our dialog in reference to the parent dialog. And I'm also creating a local window handle. We're going to use this to display back to our user the color that has been selected. So let's populate some of these default variables. So we're setting the default color to be black, and we have some options on our flags. I'm initially going to set it to full open. We'll look at the other flags we can set in a moment. So here is the display color command. It takes a number of parameters. The first is the handle of the parent dialog. The next is the X and Y coordinates that we wish our dialog to appear on the parent dialog. Next is the first color, the default color we want selected. The next parameter is a user-defined type. I'll come back to that one in a moment. The final parameter is the flags. If we have a look at the Windows help for PowerBasic, we can see that there are three flag options. Full open causes the entire dialog box to appear when created, including the section which allows the user to create custom colors. If you do not want the user in your application to be able to select custom colors, then you can use the Prevent Full Open flag. This disables the Custom Colors button, preventing the user creating any custom colors. In this case, we'll go for full open. And the final part of this command is the To option. This will populate this variable with the RGB color that the user has selected. But since we're going to allow our user to select a custom color, we need somewhere to put that information. So we're going to create a global user-defined type that we can use to hold all the colors in our custom palette. So this is our user-defined type. It's basically holding 16 long values for the 16 possible custom colors. The name of each element within this user-defined type is quite academic. It's merely a location to store a value. And we're using the global command to define a global user-defined type as this type. This means it can be accessed anywhere in the application. And as we're storing this globally, we can also save the information to a configuration file before the application ends. This allows us to pick up those values that the user has previously set as custom colours, should it be required. So let's try running the application now and see what we get. And there is our colour selection dialog appearing on screen. The user can select one of the custom colour slots, pick a custom colour, and then add it to the palette, and then hit OK. So for the purposes of this application, we'll now create a small graphics window to display to ourselves what colour the user has selected to prove that the display colour command is working correctly. So let's go back to the code. If the user does not select a colour and clicks the cancel button, then the value within our variable RGB colour value will be 0. So we can test to see that it is greater than 0 to ensure that a colour has indeed been picked. We can then use the graphics window command to display a small graphics window to our user. We're going to use the graphics clear command to set the colour of that window to the colour the user has selected. We will then sleep for 5 seconds, 5000 milliseconds, and end the graphics window. So if we run the application once more, we can select a colour from the screen, hit the OK button, and we get a graphics window on screen for the colour that the user has selected. If the user selects a custom colour, and then hits OK, that's the colour that's displayed on our screen. So we've proved that the display colour command will quite easily display the colour that the user has selected. So to prove that the custom colour has been stored in the global UDT, we can call this function once more. So here we are calling our display RGB colour function once more. So if we run our application and select one of the custom colours, pick a colour, put it into the palette and press the OK button. We display the colour and we display our selection of colour once more, and we will see that the colour initially selected in the custom palette is still there. So we have successfully stored the colour palette in our global user-defined type. So now that we've proved we can select a custom colour and a standard colour from the standard palette, let's now look at the second command, display font. We're going to create another user-defined type to hold information for font details. And this will hold 5 pieces of information. First of all, the font name. Secondly, the font size. Next, the style of the font. Then the colour, and then the character set. So in our PB main function, we're going to set some of these values to give us defaults. We can declare a user-defined type locally as our UDT font details type. We can then populate that to set the font name, the font size, and the style. You don't necessarily have to set defaults, but it doesn't do any harm. And depending on your application, you may want a default font size and font picked anyway. We're now going to create a second function called display font, taking 2 parameters. The first being the handle of the payment dialog, in this case the desktop, and the second being our user-defined type, in which we've stored our default values. So let's now create the display font function. And here is the skeleton of our new display font function taking its 2 parameters. So in here we've created a number of local variables. First of all, the X and Y coordinates. These are the coordinates that our new display font dialog is to appear at, either on the desktop or on the dialog that called this function. Then we have the default font, the default font size, the default style, the default colour, and the flag values that will describe how our dialog appears to the user. Next, we have a series of variables to hold what the user has selected: the font, the font size, the style, the colour they have selected, and the character set. We've also created 2 additional variables, a font as a D word and a window handle. We will use these when it comes time to display back to ourselves what the user has selected. First, we will set the flags: screen fonts, force font exist, and CF effects. We'll cover these in a moment. Next, we will set the defaults that we've passed in. These are populated from the user-defined type that we passed in on the parameters: the font name, the font size, and the style. Next, we can call the display font command itself. If we look at display font in the help, we will see all the flags that this particular font will support. This command has more flag options than our previous command. In this case, we're setting 3 values: screen fonts, which causes the font selection dialog box to list only the screen fonts supported by the system. Next, we're using the forced font exists. This specifies that the font selection dialog should indicate an error condition if the user attempts to select a font or style that does not exist. And finally, we're using CF effects. This specifies the font selection dialog should enable strikeout, underline, and in this case, more importantly, the color effect choices. This will allow the user to select a color for the font. In your application, if you do not want these selections, you can change the flags that are specified. And as you will see from the style settings, the styles have a number of values. These can be normal, bold, italic, underline, or strikeout. You can, of course, combine these values. So you could have both bold and italic. So here is the display font command taking its many parameters. The dialog handle, the X and Y coordinates, our default fonts, point sizes, default style, and the flags. And the values that we're pulling back from this dialog are the font the user has selected, the point size, style, RGB color, and the character set that the user has picked from that dialog. And as with the previous command, if the font selected is an empty length string, then the user has clicked the cancel button. So before we run the application, let's comment out the first 2 calls to the display color commands. And now run the application. It will now display the font selection dialog. As you will see, it has picked Comic Sans MS as the default font, Regular as the font style, and 14 point as the point size, as we selected in our defaults. The user can now change this to anything on our list. However, to prove that this selection has indeed been made, we'll need to display something on screen so we can see the selection. So as we did before, we're going to create a graphics window to allow this information to be displayed to our users. So we'll first test to see if a font has been selected, and then we'll pick up the values and store them in a user-defined type. So here we are testing the value of the font selected variable. If it is not an empty length string, then we know a font has been selected. So we can store the selections in the user-defined type. This allows the information to be passed back to the calling routine. So how do we display this information in our application? First of all, we'll need to create a new font based on the user's selections. So we can use the font new command to perform that. So here is our font new command. It takes a number of parameters. First of all, the font selected. Next, the point size, then the style, and then the character set selected. And the output from this command is to populate our hfont variable. This is the handle of the font we have created. Now that we've created a font, we can now use the graphics window command to create a new window, as we did in the previous function. In this case, we're creating a slightly wider window to allow our text to appear. Our dialog is titled as font selected, and we're passing the output from the graphics window command to the hwin variable, which is the handle of this graphics window. We then use the attach command, and finally the set font command, giving it its single parameter of the font handle. This now instructs PowerBasic that any text sent to this graphics window will be displayed in the font we have selected. In our current configuration, we've set the dialog up to allow the user to pick the colour. So we can make a test on this to see if a colour has indeed been selected, and then use the graphics colour command to instruct PowerBasic to display text in that colour. Graphics colour takes, of course, two parameters, the first being the foreground colour, and the second the background colour. We're leaving the background colour as -1 as we're not changing the background. Next, we can print some text to our graphics window, and then sleep for 5 seconds and then close the window down. This will display the text on that screen to the user. And at the end of our function, we can use the font n command to close down the resources used to create the font. PowerBasic would of course do this at the end of the application anyway, but it's always good to keep things tidy. So if we try running our application now, we will see our font selection coming up on screen. So if we change our font to something else, let's go for this one, and we will pick bold, and we'll go for 20 point. If we hit the colour selection and pick a different colour, let's go for the lime colour, and then hit OK. We can now see on our dialog, we now have that font in that colour displayed on the screen. So we have successfully selected a colour and a font and font size to display to our user. So in summary, what we've done today is to create two functions. The first to allow the user to display a colour selection dialog, from which the user can either select a standard colour or define a custom colour which we're storing in a global user-defined type. This approach will allow you to select colours from within your application. The second function was to allow the user to select a font from the standard font dialog, which allows them to pick a font size, and a display style, as well as optional colour. Within your application, this would allow the user to reconfigure your application for different fonts. Hopefully you'll find these commands useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.